All right, welcome everybody to the second course in the Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema. We are discussing the history of what's called the Western esoteric tradition. And the idea of that is that there's this genealogy of figures and ideas that provides the background context of ideas for eventually the particular more modern magical, ceremonial magical traditions today. This course, of course, focuses on Thelema, and so we have a kind of admitted retroactive viewpoint on what we're looking at and what's important about it from that point of view. But we're looking at historical material, and so hopefully what we have to say about that's going to be interesting to people from a wide range of diverse other kinds of backgrounds as well, and that'll overlap with the conversation. This session, we're going to be looking at the Rosicrucian Manifestoes, particularly the Fama Fraternitatis, the fame of the fraternity, subtitled The Discovery of the Fraternity of the Most Noble Order of the Rosy Cross. This is a work of allegory regarding the political situation within the Holy Roman Empire preceding the 30 Years' War. So that's the thumbnail description. Let me now expand that out and explain what I mean by that. The Rosicrucian Manifestoes consist of a number of different documents. There's the Fama Fraternitatis, which I just mentioned. That was published in 1614 in an anonymous tract, meaning the author wasn't identified in that tract. And then in the following year, there was the publication of a follow-up document called the Confessio Fraternitatis, or the Confession of the Laudable Fraternity of the Most Honorable Order of the Rosy Cross, written to all the learned in Europe. So there's the Fama and the Confessio. And these were both published anonymously. The Fama in 1614, the Confessio in 1615. Then there's a further document called The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. And that was published a number of years later. And its authorship was specifically acknowledged by Johann Valentine Andrea, who is probably also involved in the authorship of the earlier manifestos. So although the Chemical Wedding is kind of part of the corpus, it can also be grouped separately in separation from the Fama and the Confessio, which are the so-called Rosicrucian Manifestoes proper. We're mostly going to be looking at the first of those, the fame of the fraternity, but I'll have a few things to say as we're discussing these texts about the Confessio as well. So, usually this is treated as a document discussing an allegedly actually existing mystical organization called the Rosicrucians, but it's kind of a situation of a myth of such an order being so wonderful that it becomes necessary to realize it by actually getting people together to do it. What I mean by that is that the Rosicrucian Manifestos are a literary allegory where the story or narrative of a particular order called the Order of the Rosy Cross, or the Rosicrucians, is a metaphor standing for, you could say, a kind of proto-enlightenment, a kind of hermetic, or even you could call it a Rosicrucian enlightenment, occurring among, as the subtitle of these texts say, the learned of Europe, brought about by new conditions of the printing press and the Reformation and the Renaissance, which has produced the first phase of what we now call modernity. So the result of that is that there's a disruption of the previously existing medieval society. And this plays out over several centuries. And this manifesto is being written just before there's a major breakdown of the old feudal order that occurs. Basically, war breaks out in what's now called Germany, but there's no Germany at this time. Instead, there's the survival of this medieval federation called the Holy Roman Empire that fills up much of Central Europe and includes what's today called Germany and also Austria and other areas as well. And some of the princes that are rulers within this kind of confederation of principalities also have fiefs that are located elsewhere. I'd include this area called Bohemia, that's now kind of sort of where the current day Czech Republic is. Prague is the capital of this region. And so although that's not technically within the territory of the Holy Roman Empire, it's one of the elector states that the ruler of gets to elect who the emperor is of the Holy Roman Empire. So it's kind of part of the confederation will also not be part. So you have all these complicated divisions. And basically it's this, the Holy Roman Empire is this political mess basically that's left over from the medieval period. And it's continuing on this kind of pure momentum. And eventually the new modern conditions of the expanding colonial empires, particularly of Spain, the Spanish Empire, but also including the trading city of Amsterdam, which is rapidly setting up trade routes. Portugal is setting up a trade route all the way around the coast of Africa into India. And of course, there's the Spanish conquest in the New World of vast territories in South and Mesoamerica. So, and these areas have been expensively plundered, and there's vast wealth flowing into Europe. And there was a mass urbanization that occurred at the end of the Middle Ages, largely in the 1300s and also the 1200s. And this is concentrated in Central Europe. And so this is there's this new burgher class, this new middle class or private ownership class who are not necessarily members of the nobility, but they own significant wealth and are increasingly inserting themselves into politics. And so there's a shift in the center of gravity of political economy away from agrarian production into mercantilism, and now this emerging economy called capitalism, which operates on a global scale. And it changes the form of culture and creates this new experience of subjectivity called modernity. And basically, as the feudal order breaks out in the center of Europe and this new age, you could say, emerges, this new world, there's a war that gets fought in which, even though it's mostly centered in the territory of the HRE, it eventually draws in all of the peripheries in Europe. Sweden, France, the United Provinces, what are now called the Netherlands, all send armies in an attempt to shift the balance of power over the hegemony in Europe, which at that time is largely controlled by a particular dynastic family called the Habsburgs. And they are the rulers of the Spanish Empire. And they also control large territories throughout Europe. And this includes most of the southern part of the Italian peninsula, Sicily and Sardinia, large territories in Austria, what's now presently today Austria, including the city of Vienna, and as well as other territories. And members of this family are typically elected as emperors of the Holy Roman Empire as well. So what that means is that there's a struggle being waged to unseat or challenge the Habsburgs in their hegemony in Europe. In fact, it's a kind of global hegemony because they also control these territories in the New World. And the Habsburgs are Catholic, and their main political opponents are states which are allied to Protestantism. And there had been an earlier phase of religious wars based on confessional divisions between, allegedly based on confessional divisions between competing territories that had happened at the climax of the Reformation. This included the Peasants' War and other conflicts. And what happened is that there was a political agreement made whereby the confessional status of a particular state or principality would be determined by the religion of the ruler of that territory. And so this meant it became very important for the balance of power in Europe in terms of which states are part of either the Protestant or the Catholic military alliances, which are poised to be at war with each other all the time. That who the monarch is, who the sovereign is, who inherits what their religion is. And wars are being fought over this all over the place, wars related to succession. And so particular expectations by the Protestants come to rest on a certain figure by the name of Frederick V. And he's the prince of the Palatine region in the HRE. And its capital is in Heidelberg. So that the area around the obviously still existing city of Heidelberg, that's this area called the Palatine, and it's ruled by this prince. And he's Calvinist, and therefore he's and he's been groomed to potentially inherit this other territory, because there's this scheme that this territory, Bohemia, centered in Prague, well, it's ruled by this doddering old guy, the Emperor Rudolph, who's really into magic. And he had this court where he invited wizards from all, including John Dee and Edward Kelly, to travel from all over Europe to compare notes about the Hermetic arts. And he basically had this kind of Hermetic court in Prague, in Bohemia, back in the late 1500s. And in his later life, he kind of retreats from public life and gets really into astrology and is trying to prophesy various things. But although nominally he's Catholic, but there'd been an agreement made during the Reformation, specifically within Bohemia, which is very different than what happened in other areas in Europe, where there was an unusual level of religious freedom that was allowed. And so for that reason, this area, particularly the Transylvanian region, within Bohemia, becomes a location of intense radical religious enthusiasm, location of what's sometimes called the Radical Reformation, and all kinds of interesting radical religious and spirituality sort of get underway there. And that's where you get Unitarianism and Universalism and all kinds of interesting magical stuff going on there as well. And so anyway, Rudolph's an old guy, and so it's known he's going to kick off, and then somebody else is going to be, that there's not a regular heir, and so somebody else is going to be offered the crown. And so there's all this political maneuvering going on. And the Protestants basically come up with this plan that they're going to put Frederick V forward. Now, he's already what's called one of the electors within the Holy Roman Empire. And when there's an opening for who gets to be the emperor, there's 7 territories within the Holy Roman Empire where the rulers of those territories are what are called electors. They each have a vote to elect the emperor. And up till now, or at least over the past century, so this has usually been a member of the Habsburgs family. And so that has basically allowed for Catholic hegemony to be, Protestantism is allowed within various of the states, but the balance of power within the HRE is towards the Catholics. And so the Protestants are going to upset that by making Frederick the ruler of Bohemia, and then they're going to have 2 votes. And by the way, within the 7, 3 of them are Catholic and 3 of them are Protestant. And so Bohemia is the seventh swing vote. And so if the Protestants can capture that vote, they can then have 5 votes, and then the HRE can be made Catholic. And so there's all kinds of like esoteric millennial expectation in Hermetic occult Lutheran circles in the German territories. And at the University of Tübingen, which includes an important seminary, and this is in the area of Württemberg, which is just south of the Palatine. And there's a kind of Tübingen, what's called the Tübingen Circle. It's a group of writers, intellectuals, occultists. And they're particularly interested, kind of their focal point is Paracelsian alchemy as a kind of Hermetic philosophy, spirituality. And they see both Martin Luther and Paracelsus as prophetic figures, bringing about what they call the General Reformation. And what the General Reformation is going to be a general spiritual awakening of humanity, basically, which will complete the work of the Reformation and breaking up the old medieval order, the old age, the old eon. There's going to be a new age, a kind of new eon, where everybody's going to be enlightened, and particularly a kind of new science is going to come about, which they see as a kind of natural magic. Paracelsian alchemy is kind of, and medicine, Paracelsian alchemy is their paradigm for this. But it's also merged with a kind of natural magic and Hermetic spirituality that comes out of Ficino's Renaissance magic that we looked at in the other course. It's the Fama Fraternitatis. And then this was then subsequently published about 4 years later, more in the period of the fervor around this scheme around Frederick V. And there's a thesis by Frances Yates, the author of the Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition. She also wrote a book called the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, which is about this network of associations. And her thesis is that the publication of the manifestos was part of a kind of a political campaign to support this plan that of putting forward Frederick for this particular attempt to swing the balance of power in Europe. And there were these millennial expectations around that. I'll say more about that in a moment, but I do want to just, before turning to look at the actual manifesto itself, sort of tell you the story of what actually happens with the outbreak of the 30 Years' War. So what happened is that in 1619, Frederick was offered the crown of Bohemia, and he decided to take it. But then a year later, he was forced to flee Prague in the early part of 1620, when Habsburg forces loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand, who ruled from Vienna, which is actually just south of Prague. And he sent an army into Bohemia. And basically this starts the 30 Years' War, because then all the Protestants come in on the side of Ferdinand, on the side of Frederick, and then the Catholic allies come in on the side of Ferdinand. And then once these armies are in motion, they have their own economic kind of impetus. It becomes economically difficult once you're fielding one of these armies to disband it, and there's no easy way to just send everybody home. And so once an army is in the field and they're out there and they're basically raiding and pillaging to keep themselves going, that these armies just stay in the field for years, and then they keep fighting with other armies which are doing the same thing. And basically this goes on for decades until everybody is completely, the whole of Europe is basically exhausted by this warfare, and it kind of grinds finally to a halt. And there are pauses, of course, when one or another of the states involved is so economically depleted that they have to, there's a gap politically before they can remobilize and start another campaign. But basically the war ends in exhaustion rather than in victory. But the military power of the Spanish Empire, basically on the continent, was permanently broken. And what this means then is that France and England then emerge as the major European colonial powers. And we then shifted into the next phase of the development of modernity. And so this is one of those big pivot points. And so that in a way, the prophecy of the manifestos is fulfilled, although there is this apocalypse that creates a new age. But this process of apocalypse, which is perhaps we could think of as being modernity itself, kind of continues and is still ongoing in a way. And this is what makes the manifestos so interesting, is because they're in a way still magically operative. It's kind of complicated what that might mean, but it's useful to back up and look at these texts anyway. The other important thing about the 30 Years' War is the point where the medieval project of recreating the Roman Empire breaks down as a dynastic project that is basically linked to feudalism. And then this is replaced by the competition of colonial empires. And so feudalism is replaced by nationalism. And this is the war where at the beginning of the war, it's a kind of feudal war based on confessional differences. And by the end of the war, it's a struggle between different nation states, which have kind of economically and politically reorganized themselves on this new basis. And now the competition is nationalist, or national competition between national powers. And the confessional element, although it's still in play, now becomes subordinate to that more fundamentally nationalist competition. Actual text of the Forma Fraternitatis. But first, one more thing about the symbolism and how this links to political events at the time. So there's particular millennial expectation. So one of the themes is that the tomb of Christian Rosenkreutz has been closed for 120 years. Why is that number special? Why is it 120 years? Well, there's a little bit of number stuff that's going on. So according to the Confessio Fraternitatis, Christian Rosenkreutz was born in 1378, and he lived 106 years. So that means he died in 1483. Well, 1483 just happens to be the same year that Martin Luther died, okay? And of course, Martin Luther's coat of arms is a rose and a cross, although in his case, the cross is within the rose rather than the rose within the cross. But it's his coat of arms, and that appeared on all the pamphlets he published. And so it's a kind of icon or symbol for the Protestant cause generally. And so that's why they're called the Rosicrucians, you see, is because it's an allusion to Martin Luther's coat of arms. But it's also kind of literary because it's all about these tracts that are now being published because there's this thing called the printing press that's causing all these changes. So if Christian Rosenkreutz dies in 1483 and his remains are concealed from the world for 120 years, then that means that the date when the vault is opened in the manifesto is 1604. And what's important about that is that there was, particularly in astrological circles, there was significant interest in that year because there were two nova that occurred that created new stars that appeared in the skies, in the constellations of Serpentarius and Cygnus, so the serpent and the swan. Obviously, this must have some mystical, magical import, right? And so for a lot of the Protestant radicals at this time, this meant that there was going to be a new age during which the Pope would finally be overthrown. And so 1604 then is the key date in the prophecies of a certain Simon Studian, and he's a writer who's active in Württemberg, which is the same location as that the city of Tübingen is in, and where this literary circle of Rosicrucians is. And so his prophecies obviously influenced the Tübingen circle. And so when Johann Valentine Andrea, Christoph Bessel, and Tobias Hess write their manifesto, or collaborate in some way, maybe Andrea wrote it or they gave him the ideas. We don't really know what the writing process was. It includes this prophetic material, which I think is very interesting. So regarding the Pope, the Confessio Fraternitatis says, regarding the forthcoming New Age, he says, quote, God is far otherwise pleased, for he exalteth the lowly and pulleth down the proud with disdain. To those which are a few words, he sendeth his holy angel to speak with them. This might be, we might think of this as a reference to the holy guardian angel. But the unclean babblers he driveth in the wilderness and solitary places, the which is the right reward of the Romish seducers, who have vomited forth their blasphemies against Christ, and as yet do not abstain from their lies in this clear shining light. In Germany, all their abominations and detestable tricks have been disclosed, that thereby he may fulfill the measure of sin and draw near to the end of his punishment. This is the Pope, of course. Therefore, one day it will come to pass that the mouth of those vipers will be stopped, and the triple crown, this is the papal tiara, will be brought to naught, as thereof at our meeting shall be more plain and at large discoursed. And so it says, we speak unto you by parables, but would willingly bring you to the right, simple, easy, and ingenuous exposition, understanding, declaration of knowledge of all secrets. And that's what it says in the Confessio Fraternitatis. Regarding the obvious fact that these new stars appearing in the heaven means that now finally the Pope and Mahomet will be overthrown. And then there'll be the general Reformation, and there'll be a new kind of utopian horizon that will open up, and there'll be a new science, and there'll be a new arts, and there'll be a new culture, and there'll be a new world that's going to emerge. Okay. And so that's why there's the number 120 that appears. So the figure of Christian Rosenkreuz, obviously a kind of synthetic allegory, combining Martin Luther, Paracelsus, and Jesus Christ, but the Christ here is not so much the historical Jesus as we might call him the alchemical Christ. Maybe a little bit similar to what the hippies called the cosmic Christ, but specifically related to a genre of alchemical texts where the resurrection of Jesus depicted in the Gospels is taken as a metaphor for the alchemical process of spiritual regeneration of the alchemist. And so this is the this is the way in which the CRC as the risen Christ metaphor relates to the basic theme of Paracelsian alchemy that's going on in this text as the paradigm for a new scientific basis for the knowledge of the world. And this is going to be achieved through a kind of natural magic, of which, as I said, Paracelsian alchemy is the basis. And so there's this thing they keep talking about in the text called the centrum. Okay, well, the centrum is, now they're Lutherans, so maybe this is going to be a little bit boring for us, but for them, that's faith in Jesus Christ from the Gospels as taught by Luther that gives salvation and is free from popish superstition. And so this is the being centered in the cosmic or alchemical Christ as the basis for spiritual regeneration. That's the centrum. And then the knowledge of the center and the ability to know the secrets of nature and spirit that orient one towards that is, and the example they give is the different points of the globe where you've created a map of the world through science. And then all the points on the globe, if you follow them, they lead to the pole. They lead to the centrum, because they're all points on that lead around on the globe and you can all from all those points get to the centrum. And so this map is created by what are called the axiomata. And this is the magical language of correspondences. And this is again described in the Confessio. Let me read you this passage. They refer to the great book of nature. And there's these characters and letters, the magical significations that you know to be able to work natural magic. These characters and letters, and God hath here and there incorporated them in the Holy Scriptures, the Bible, so hath he imprinted them most apparently into the wonderful creation of heaven and earth, yea, and all beasts. And so this is a standard theological trope between the two books of wisdom, which are the book of Scripture and the book of nature. So that like as the mathematician and astronomer can long before see and know the eclipses which are to come, so we may verily foreknow and foresee the darkness and obscurations of the church and how long they shall last, meaning when shall the Pope be overthrown. From the which characters or letters we have borrowed our magic writing and have found out and made a new language for ourselves, in the which withal is expressed and declared the nature of all things. All right. And so this is called the Book M, the book where they've written up all the magical language of correspondences, and these are inscribed in something called the Book M, which probably means the Latin word mundi for world. And again, the idea is that the magical signatures are the letters written in the book of nature in parallel to the book of Scripture. And that's the reason that there's this allegory of the tomb of Christian Rosenkreuz, because the idea is that the tomb is an allegory of the way that the microcosm of the human person is an image of the macrocosm, or the divine, larger cosmic spiritual reality, which is, and remember that for this type of Hermetic science, that the cosmos has a soul. So the world is alive, is a living being, kind of like the Gaia hypothesis. And so you have the divine creation, which is then present within the body of nature itself as its own kind of divinity. And this is also a kind of pagan element, which is that implicitly there's also a kind of nature worship that is, I think, going on in this type of Hermeticism. And I think that's certainly fine from a neo-pagan perspective. And in fact, what's kind of interesting about the Confessio is that in a way it's a kind of apology, because there'd been some concern when the Fama Fraternitatis was published the year before that it was too pagan because of the element of Ficinian Hermeticism, which is part of the synthesis of the ideas of Hermetic science. And of course, Paracelsus and the Paracelsians are all good Lutherans, but hardy, pious, German religious people. But they're open to criticism for being Schwärmerei, for being religious enthusiasts, particularly in this kind of pagan magical element. So the Confessio is an attempt to say, yes, we're magicians, but we're also good Christians at the same time. And so just as we're reading the book of nature, you should also read diligently in the Holy Scriptures to know that the centrum, this centering in the alchemical Christ that leads to regeneration and therefore the salvation of the world. And I think what makes this really interesting is that part of the cultural impact then of the manifestos is that it's the first of a long line of modern manifestos proclaiming a new age. So that would include, say, Descartes' Discourse on Method, which is a kind of scientific manifesto, which actually creates the new science that is just prophesied in the Rosicrucian Manifestoes. And in fact, Descartes is in a way kind of, he didn't necessarily explicitly think of himself as a Rosicrucian, but he really exemplifies the ideal of the Rosicrucian. He is himself a kind of Rosicrucian magician scientist in a lot of ways. And his discourse on method has a number of interesting parallels, indirect, admittedly, with the manifesto. So, for example, he talks about creating a new way of life for himself that's a little bit suspiciously similar to kind of the rule or way of life of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. And this is going to allow him to more deeply understand the Book of Nature and so on and so forth. Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto obviously qualifies as examples of a manifesto of a new human age that has this kind of utopian projection, historical projection, and that also has this Gnostic element because it communicates a certain methodology that you're going to be able to read or understand history. He's going to teach you the secret of history is class struggle, is the key to class struggle to ultimately overcome it. And then, of course, there's Aleister Crowley's The Book of the Law as a manifesto of a new eon that relates to the practice of magic and a certain type of scientific methodology applied to magic as a science and art of causing change with conformity of will. And of course, then there's this idea lurking behind all of this, which is the idea that modern science is itself a form of magic. It is inseparable from a type of techno-Gnosticism, which we could identify with the experience of modernity itself. I refer to some of the writings of Juan Culiano in particular in terms of articulating the particular genealogy of this idea, which is not obviously original to me. Particularly, there's a good chapter on this in Juan Culiano's book, The Tree of Gnosis, which is worth taking a look at. And so from that point of view, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz are kind of Rosicrucian, quote unquote, scientist philosophers. And the shift here, though, is that once we get past the 30 Years' War, Cartesianism replaces something like Paracelsian alchemy as a paradigm that is more current with what people are looking for. And then there's also the figure of Francis Bacon, who's on the saints list. And he wrote this little allegory called the New Atlantis, which also has some indirect similarities to what's going on in the Fama Fraternitatis, where it's also talking about how there's going to be a new age based on scientific discovery. And that's going to establish the new paradigm. Okay, can everybody see the Fama Fraternitatis on their screen?
Yep.
Great, okay. So, Dan, could you read us that first paragraph there?
Sure, only the Fama Fraternitatis, a discovery of the fraternity of the most noble order of the Rosy Cross. Seeing the only wise and merciful God in these latter days hath poured out so richly his mercy and goodness to mankind, whereby do we attain more and more to the perfect knowledge of his Son, Jesus Christ, and nature, that justly we may boast of the happy time, wherein there is not only discovered unto us the half part of the world, which was heretofore unknown and hidden, but he hath also made manifest unto us many wonderful and never heretofore seen works and creatures of nature, and moreover hath raised, imbued with great wisdom, who might partly renew and reduce all arts in this our age spotted and imperfect to perfection, so that finally man might thereby understand his own nobleness and worth, and why he is called microcosmos, and how far his knowledge extendeth into nature.
Okay, and that's all one sentence. See how wonderful rhetoric used to be, where they'd have these long sentences. Okay, so seeing the only wise and merciful God in these latter days. Okay, it's the time of the apocalypse, at the end times. And there's going to be a new world and a new heaven and a new earth. And in those times has been poured out richly his mercy and goodness to mankind, whereby we attain more perfectly to the knowledge of his son, Jesus Christ in nature. Okay, there's the two books. The book of scripture, which gives knowledge of salvation through faith in Jesus Christ, and the book of nature, through which in parallel to that, co-equally perhaps, imbues a kind of gnosis, a kind of salvatory knowledge of the medicines and the sciences and natural magic that gives a new type of utopian control over the world in which we're able to achieve a kind of new heavenly world within this world. And then it says, wherein is not only discovered unto us the half part of the world, so that's the discovery of the new world, which has created the conditions of the new modern experience. So the Middle Ages are over, this new period of global communication that is politically being driven by European commercial expansionism is now brought the whole world into communication with itself. And so there's this new, for the first time, there's this new global community. But it's still in the bondage of the old age, the old eon of medieval superstition and error. And this is particularly represented by the twin heresies of Islamic and Catholic exoteric false religion. And this is to be contrasted with the mystical esoteric core that has been disclosed through the freedom of faith and the liberty of the gospel and the Reformation. And this is represented on the one hand by Luther's, salvation, sola scriptura, through just yourself. You can read the scripture and save yourself. You don't need to be mediated through obedience to the Pope. So salvation is something you can achieve individually. And then this magical idea of the Hermetic, the Renaissance magic, Hermetic adept who achieves this alchemical regeneration and achieves this sanctification of grace, not just through reading scripture, but through practicing magic. And that's this, these hidden wonders. The new occult science has emerged, giving us new understanding of the works and creatures of nature, and moreover hath raised men to imbue them with great wisdom so that they become realized as the microcosm, reflection of the macrocosm. And so the divinized human person is but a mirror or image of the divine or divinized great holy soul of the cosmos itself. And these mirror and reflect each other, and this is disclosed through natural magic. And then you have this kind of ideal, and then the realization of that ideal is going to be this figure, is this figure of Christian Rosicrucian, who's going to emerge in the next long sentence paragraph. So Henry, could you read us the second very long sentence?
Yes. Although the rude world herewith will be but little pleased, but rather smile and scoff thereat, also the pride and covetousness of the learned is so great, it will not suffer them to agree together. But were they united, they might out of all those things which in this our age God doth so richly bestow upon us, collect librum naturae,
The book of nature,
a perfect method of all arts. But such is their opposition that they still keep and are loath to leave the old course, esteeming popery, Aristotle, and Galen. You might have to scroll down a little bit.
sorry, let me do that.
Yea, and that which hath but a mere show of learning, more than the clear and manifested light and truth, who, if they were now living, with much joy would leave their erroneous doctrines.
Meaning Aristotle and Galen, if they knew what we knew now, they would leave their doctrines and be on our side. And then keep going there.
But here's too great weakness for such a great work. And although in theology, physic, and the mathematics, the truth doth manifest itself, nevertheless the old enemy by his subtlety and craft doth show himself in hindering every good purpose by his instruments and contentious wavering people.
This, of course, is the devil, is the old enemy.
To such an intent of a general reformation,
There we go, the general reformation.
the most godly and highly illuminated father, our brother, C.R. Christian Rosenkranz, a German, the chief and original of our fraternity, hath much and long time labored, who by reason of his poverty, although descended from noble parents, in the 5th year of his age was placed in a cloister where he had learned indifferently the Greek and Latin tongues, who, upon his earnest desire and request, being yet in his growing years, was associated to a brother, P.A.L., who had determined to go to the Holy Land.
Okay, so the mention of Aristotle and Galen as this identifies the authors of the manifesto with, first of all, the new humanist tradition of learning, which started in Catholicism, but has now migrated into Protestantism, because if you're in the Catholic lands, there's now this thing called the Counter-Reformation going, and all this new humanist learning that started with Erasmus and Ficino and the Italian Renaissance, that's now all been censored and put on the ban, and you're not allowed to study it. And instead, you're supposed to go and learn with the Jesuits, and they're going to tell you what the true doctrine is, and they're the ones who are allowed to. And their philosophy and the philosophy of the other teaching orders in Catholicism, particularly the Dominicans, is called scholasticism, and it's based largely on Aristotle and Aquinas. And the new humanism that's now emerging, particularly among the Protestant intelligentsia in Northern and Western Europe, wants to break away from scholasticism, and they want to develop a new methodology, a new science, and a new method of doing philosophy that's going to permit them to do that. And that is in the process of happening. And what's eventually going to win out and form the new paradigm is this thing called Cartesianism, which hasn't happened yet, because Descartes is going to be a soldier in the 30 Years' War. And then at the end of the war, he's going to have a vision where God is going to appear to him and tell him that he's going to be the new Aristotle. And so, but that hasn't happened yet. But the manifesto here is seeing itself as a prophecy of that. And then Galen, that of course identifies them with the Paracelsian camp, because Paracelsus was saying that the new medicine that needed to be brought about needed to reject the teachings of Galen and Celsus, who had been the previous authors on medicine, and Theophrastus Bombastus, which is the actual name of Paracelsus, and is where we get the slang term speaking with a lot of bombast. It comes from his last name, Bombastus, because he was such a prolific polemicist. And he took the pen name Paracelsus because he claimed that he was greater than Celsus, the ancient medical expert. So anyway, so this mention of Aristotle and Galen identifies them with the new humanism, and also with the is a clue that they're Paracelsian, interested in Paracelsian alchemy. Then this reference where it says, in theology, physics, and mathematics, the truth does manifest itself. That's the threefold division of topics in Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. And so this might seem to be just a throwaway reference, but in fact, it's actually a citation to kind of their genealogy, the source tradition, which is, particularly as Germans, they're getting the Ficino tradition of natural magic through Agrippa, is kind of their primary interlocutor for that. And so this is actually a reference to the division of topics from that as their source. So they're in addition to being Paracelsian alchemists, they're also magicians, specifically in the Agrippan kind of tradition of the which derives from Ficino's Renaissance magic, the ideal of the Hermetic adept. Okay, so then let's skip forward. Let me look at my notes. To page 10. And then 10 Taryn, could you please read for us, starting where it says, such a one likewise hath Theophrastus.
Such a one likewise hath Theophrastus Paracelsus been in vocation and callings, although he was none of our fraternity, yet nevertheless hath he diligently read over the book M, whereby his sharp ingenium was exalted. But this man was also hindered in his course by the multitude of the learned and wise seeming men, that he was never able peaceably to confer with others of his knowledge and understanding he had of nature. And therefore in his writing he rather mocked these busybodies, and doth not show them altogether what he was. Yet nevertheless there is found within him well grounded the aforementioned harmonia, which without doubt he had imparted to the learned, if he had not found them rather worthy of subtle vexation, than to be instructed in greater arts and sciences. He then, with a free and careless life, lost his time and left unto the world their foolish pleasures.
Okay, so they're directly and explicitly stating that Christian Rosenkreutz is modeled on their ideal, which is Paracelsus, as an example of the Hermetic adept, of the kind of the wandering magician possessed of wisdom, who's rejected by the world, but if you can listen to them, they're gonna initiate you, give you the secrets. And so there's the reference to the book M, which is the book of nature, which contains the signatures of natural magic, whereby you can know the particular actions that will produce the results that you wish, even though they appear marvelous to the vulgar. That this includes medicines. And it says that his ingenium was exalted, meaning his reason was exalted, meaning his intelligence was enhanced. He achieves the ideal of the scientist sage, which is this kind of medical scientific wizard ideal that's going on in the Rosicrucian Manifestoes, which I think is really, really interesting. And then, of course, the harmonia that's mentioned is this thing elsewhere called the axiomata, which again is this magical language of correspondences, this system of, now, of course, the Thelemic version of that is the tables of correspondence in 777, although we're getting ahead of ourselves there. Anyway, so there follows the allegory of Christian Rosenkreutz. Basically, he travels to the east and receives wisdom. And so again, he's a kind of synthesis of the ancient myth, and this goes back all the way to Roman times, of there's secret initiatory wisdom that comes from the east. And whether this is Persia for the Romans or for the Western Latin Christians, this is the Islamic world, where a lot of the wisdom from the and texts and knowledge from the earlier antiquity that had been lost in the chaos of the Dark Ages had been preserved in the Islamic civilization, and then is recovered in the High Middle Ages by the European intelligentsia. And that includes Aristotle, but it includes a whole bunch of magical texts. It eventually, of course, included the Corpus Hermeticum, writings of Plato, and this brings about the Hermetic awakening that's part of the integral to the Renaissance and is now feeding in, we see, to the emergence of modern science as a paradigm in modernity. And of course, this is very basic to Frances Yates's thesis, originally set forth in the her book on Giordano Bruno, which is that the later positivist tradition, rationalist tradition of scientific naturalism that eventually emerges, particularly in the British Empire, but there's obviously French and German parallels of this, sees magic and science as opposed domains. But if you actually look at the history of the development of natural science, it is rarely separable from natural magic. That these are really, in many ways, the same field, and that this doesn't really get differentiated as such, maybe even until the 19th century. There's some there's some movements in this direction, maybe with a little bit with the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century, but these fields are really kind of merged early on, and then they get separated. And I think there's a valid proposal that they're falsely separated, and that we should see quantum mechanics, for example, just as an alchemy that works, and general relativity as a cosmology that explains the universe just as well as Aristotle does, except it does it better. And of course, Newton's a magician. And anyway, we'll get to this more as we continue with this series. But I just want to mention that. So anyway, the figure of Christian Rosenkreutz consolidates in one figure this idea of getting wisdom from the East. And then there's the founding of the actual order. And they have some rules. And down here where it says their agreement with this, Dan, could you read there, that paragraph?
Their agreement was this first, that none of them should profess any other thing than to cure the sick, and that gratis, none of that posterity should be constrained to wear one certain kind of habit, but therein to follow the custom of the country. That every year upon this day C, they should meet together in the house S, Spiritus, or write the cause of his absence. 4. Every brother should look about for a worthy person who, after his decease, might succeed him. 5. The word RC should be their seal, mark, and character. 6. The fraternity should remain secret 100 years. These 6 articles they bound themselves one to another to keep, and 5 of the brethren departed, only the brethren. Okay.
And so they disperse into the world. And this is like Jesus sending forth the disciples to go out and preach to the world. So there's again, the gospel allegory there. But so you've got the 5 basic rules, that they should be doctors of the sick and operate for free. This is the ideal of the Paracelsian magician and of the alchemical healer looking for the elixir of life. They shouldn't be constrained to wear one certain kind of habit, but they should follow the custom of their country that they're in. So this is when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And it also means that this is the idea of the secret masters, right? This is the hidden adepts that move among us secretly unknown, carrying out their various operations to enlighten humanity, but they possess the secret knowledge. That every year they should meet upon the day C. This is probably the Feast of Corpus Christi, the feast of the body of Jesus, which the mystical body of Jesus, I should say, which is associated with the summer solstice. And so there's some solar symbolism here as well. Again, with the cosmic or alchemical Christ related to the sun as the center of spirit or divinity, a kind of a symbol of God within the physical solar system. The house S Spiritus, the house of the Holy Spirit. This is the invisible college where the Rosicrucians meet and have their meetings, and gets picked up again as a theme in the Book of the Law, where it talks about the invisible house that shall stand till the fall of the eon, even though it be burnt down. That's a reference to this house of the Spirit that's referenced in the and it's the invisible college of the inner order. And then every brother should have a worthy successor, that the order should continue, and that everybody that's initiated should look to initiate others. And that the word RC, Rose Cross, should be their seal, mark, and character. And then that the fraternity should remain secret 100 years, which is again a kind of millennial prophecy. Okay, and then there's the allegory of the vault of Christian Rosenkreutz, which we can look at that in a minute if you want, but I just want to point out 2 other passages here that summarize the Oh, I see, just a moment. I need to go to the next text. Everyone can still see this, right, on the screen? Good.
Yes.
Good. Okay. Down here in the lower right where it says, howbeit we know after a time. So this is the general call for the proclamation of the general Reformation. Henry, if you could read this paragraph.
Howbeit we know after a time there will now be a general reformation, both of divine and human things, according to our desire and the expectation of others. For it is fitting that before the rising of the sun there should appear and break forth aurora, or some clearness or divine light in the sky. And so in the meantime, some few who shall give their names may join together, thereby to increase the number and respect of our fraternity and make a happy and wished-for beginning of our philosophical canons, prescribed to us by our brother R.C., and be partakers with us of our treasures, which can never fail or be wasted, in all humility and love to be eased of this world's labor, and not walk so blindly in the knowledge of the wonderful works of God.
Okay, so there's your proclamation of the general Reformation, re-summarizing most of the points we've been making. Oh, and by the way, when Jacob Boehme comes along and a few years later writes his first big book, its title is The Aurora, or The Daybreak. And by the way, there's this Hermetic Society of Magicians in Victorian England, and their name is the Order of the Golden Dawn. And then their inner order turns out to be that you're initiated within the tomb of Christian Rosicrucians. So again, it's all linking back to this, the basic themes of this text. And now, Taryn, if you could read just this last paragraph, and although at this time.
And although at this time we make no mention either of names or meetings, yet nevertheless everyone's opinion shall assuredly come to our hands, in what language soever it be, nor anybody shall fail, whoso gives his name, but to speak with some of us, whether by word of mouth or else, if there be some let in writing. And this we say for a truth, that whosoever shall earnestly and from his heart bear affection unto us, it shall be beneficial to him in goods, body, and soul. But he that is false-hearted or only greedy of riches, the same first of all shall not be able in any manner of wise to hurt us, but bring himself to utter ruin and destruction. Also, our building, although 100,000 people had very near seen and beheld the same, shall forever remain untouched, undestroyed, and hidden to the wicked world.
And then
Sub
it
umbra
ends with this
alarum
Latin phrase.
Jehovah.
Yeah. Sub umbra alarum torum Jehovah, under the shadow of the wings of Jehovah, which is this under the shadow of the wings of grace. And there's eschatological language here. So the 100,000 people are like the 100,000 elders in the book of Revelation who have seen the risen Lord. And again, there's this building that seems to this invisible college of the Holy Spirit, which has, to the eyes of the world, appears as though it's been destroyed, but in fact has either been spiritually rebuilt or is invisibly indestructible. Or and this is, of course, a metaphor for faith, but also for the magical gnosis and for its continued transmission under these new conditions of this new age of modernity. And of course, I think there's also an allusion here to the gospel parable, which says, ask and you shall find, knock and the door shall be opened to you. So the idea is that there's this metaphor of the secret order, but really this is just a metaphor for the spirit of enlightenment of humanity. And so anybody who earnestly seeks after this shall embody it themselves, just like Christian Rosenkreutz, the magical adept, embodies in their own, in the allegory of their tomb. It's as if they become themselves like unto the risen Christ, and their body is found alchemically undamaged, presumably awaiting the general resurrection or whatever the intended biblical parable or parallelism might be for that particular passage. But the idea is, just as with Christian Rosenkreuz, so with us, we can ourselves achieve in our spirit this alchemical regeneration that shall also, just as it regenerates us personally, shall regenerate the entire world. And that's the ideal of the Rosicrucian Manifestoes, and that becomes the ideal of the modern magical paradigm, which of course will soon begin to further exceed its Christian boundaries, which is, it's already kind of straining in this text a little bit. And that's going to become more pronounced as we continue. But at this point, we've got about 20 minutes left in the class, and so I want to open some questions or discussion. Anybody have any thoughts, what they want to share with us, or ask some questions, or lead the discussion in any particular direction you want to go? Don't be shy. While you're thinking of that, oh, Dan, go ahead.
Can you go kind of elaborate on the sub umbra alarm Torah Mihola a little bit?
It's from I think either the Psalms or the Proverbs. Maybe it's the Psalms. It's just a verse from the Old Testament, but it's in the vein of, say, as a stranger in a strange land, I journeyed through the valley of death, but where the shadow of the evil one was over me, but I was protected from that because I was under the shadow of God's wings, of his angels, and so I was able to be protected from evil. It's a metaphor for grace. And the idea is that those who walk in the path of the faithful will be secretly they'll be magically warded. They'll be under the protection of spiritual forces. They'll have the 4 archangels at the cross of the elements and be protected from qliphothic forces. And indeed, they talk about how when Christian Rosenkreuz was in Fez, that he obtained powers over what they call the elementals. This means the elemental daimons that are subjected by the angelic high magic or transcendental magic of the alchemical adept. And of course, this is all has its parallelisms within Hermetic or Golden Dawn or Thelemic magic, where the knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel has the theurgic function of them facilitating assisting the magician to facilitate whatever thaumaturgic works they want to then carry out by summoning whatever particular formation of elemental spirits is going to then affect that working, like in John Dee's Enochian magic, where you have the 4 elemental tablets, and then they've got all these letters, and then through making acrostics with the letters based on different patterns, you summon different sets of elemental spirits, or there's this particular hierarchy of spirits that their names are produced by making these different combinations. And then those energize or actualize the elemental potencies or signatures that through natural magic then affect the operations that you want to achieve thaumaturgically. But this is all underlined by this kind of theurgic piety where you're aiming to, yes, like in Liber 65 is divided into various chapters. So, any other questions, comments, thoughts about this text? Why it's cool, why it's weird, what you like about it, what you maybe don't like about it?
I think I want to understand more about the author's intent in publishing it, right? So it's a
That's obscure. Yeah, that's what's obscure about it. Meaning that it's not completely clear. So Yates's thesis is that the publication of it correlates or corresponds to the political event of this particular succession crisis going on within the Holy Roman Empire, and that there's millennial or prophetic expectations that Frederick V has become seen as this kind of, he's supposed to be this figure to carry out this kind of prophecy where the forces aligned against the Reformation are going to finally be defeated, and then maybe the last days will finally come about. And so it's linked to certain prophecies in the book of Revelation about like stars falling from heaven and stuff like that. And so these two new stars that appeared in the sky were seen as maybe a confirmation of that prophecy. Martin Luther had said that the Pope was the Antichrist, and that the overthrow of the Pope would be the sign that the last days were at hand. And so that's also part of it. It's not clear that a lot of the political fervor around Frederick probably happened after the actual manifesto was written, though. So it probably doesn't the text itself probably doesn't directly correlate with Frederick's ascendancy, but the publication of the text might have a kind of correlation with that political event. So and it apparently circulated in manuscript before it was published. It's not clear with whom or how that occurred. It's not reconstructible, but clearly it is quite possible that it was published by somebody who wasn't the authors. And so their intent in publishing it may have been different than the author's intent in writing it. And so there's a bit of a disjunction there as well. And then the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, which may have been written even earlier, is more just a regular alchemical allegory about personal spiritual regeneration. And so it's probably not connected at all to these political events, and may only have an indirect relationship with the manifestos, meaning the main character in the manifestos, who's just referred to as the brothers CRC, which obviously means Christian Rosenkreutz, but his name is never given in the manifesto itself. But it obviously derives from somebody who's read the Chemical Wedding, as that text was circulating in manuscript. And we know that was written by Johann Andrea. And so either it's him and his friends then reading this text, which they would have read, and then using that name. If Andrea himself is the author or one of the authors of the manifestos, then it would make sense that he would use his own character because it's already part of his writings that he's involved in. So I don't know if that answers your question, or that at least gives some additional information in play about the issue of author intent. Another factor here is that there's a whole history of reception of these documents, which quickly moves at this kind of tangential angle from whatever the author's intent was. So if these are an allegory of Lutheran millennial expectations with regards to political events occurring in the early 1600s, that constellation of factors is obsolete even by the middle of the 1600s. So the popularity of the manifestos continues, but they become increasingly treated as a magically symbolic text, or they're taken literally as actually referring to some actually existing secret brotherhood that you're trying to get in communication with. And then there's various actually existing magical organizations that attempt to either be or be the successor of that alleged group of people. And one way to think about that would be to say that this represents a shift in the way that the text is being written, in the way the text is being read, that is parallel to a larger interpretive shift or strategy of interpretation that's going on with modernity itself, which is the shift from allegory to symbol. And this is something we talked about in the first course in the lecture that I gave on Porphyry's Cave of the Nymphs. So again, if anybody wants to take a look at those lectures, but here I'll just mention that if an allegory is something that has a more direct one-to-one correlation, a symbol is more existential and metaphorical in a more broader sense. And so just as the strategy of interpreting texts, whether that's in the novel or the way that rhetoric works, generally in modernity, shifts away from allegory and becomes more symbolic, particularly in so-called modern or modernist literature. In a similar way, the way that the Rosicrucian Manifestoes are interpreted shifts away from a direct allegory that would relate to particular political events when it was written, and it becomes more broadly symbolic. And so that's how you get to texts like Paul Foster Case's The True and Invisible Rosicrucian Order, which has a whole section interpreting the Rosicrucian Manifestoes in terms of the Golden Dawn's system of tarot correspondences, which can't possibly be what the authors intended. But it doesn't matter because, as Jacques Derrida has taught us, the relationship between sign and referent, between signifier and signified, is historically mutable. And so it's quite possible for someone like Paul Case to come along later and come up with a completely self-consistent interpretation of the Rosicrucian Manifestoes in terms of a system of correspondences which doesn't yet exist in the manifesto itself, but can be seen as anticipated by or prophesied by the text itself. In other words, the text calls for there to be a system of correspondences to interpret it that may not in fact exist yet when the text is written, but somebody later can come along and come up with one and read it in terms of that, and that may violate something called author's intent, but it is a hermeneutical strategy, and it's a magical hermetic hermeneutical strategy. And so why not? You can interpret it that way. That's how it's been interpreted. I still like to keep in play Frederick Jameson's dictum to always historicize as a part of my methodology. And so when I'm looking at more novel strategies of interpretation of the text, like Case's interpretation of the manifestos, I like to always keep in play and keep awareness of what can be interpreted of the what remains accessible of author's intent as a way to historicize the document at the same time, just because I think it's good to keep that as part of the conversation, even while realizing that there are going to be interpretations. The text is done. There's going to be a historical evolution of the way that the text is interpreted that may become sometimes even radically unmoored from any kind of author's intent. And the Rosicrucian Manifestos are a good example of that. But then that becomes a way for the text to retain its relevance as well for later 19th, 20th, and 21st century magicians that still make reference to this text. I would say that Rosicrucianism in a primary sense is still alive and well in Thelema, for example, as a kind of it's part of the conversation. It provides a set of symbols and metaphors that are still part of the tradition of magic that we're practicing today. I think we've got time maybe for one or two more questions. Anybody else? Robert, Taryn, do you have anything you wanted to add or say?
No, not at this time. Thanks for the class, Nathan.
Yeah. Robert, did you want to add anything to the conversation before we reach the 30-minute mark after 3 o'clock? All right, text note, nothing here, but also thank you. Okay, well then, Dan or Henry, anything more you wanted to say or add? Final questions before we sum up.
Nope, I'll just say that I appreciate the answer you just gave me. I do think that it's interesting to kind of have an appreciation for the context in which something was originally conceived of, but also recognize that that doesn't invalidate its sort of repurposing in a way that might give it continued life. I think that's a compelling perspective.
Hegel has this famous remark he makes in his philosophy of history that the owl of Minerva flies only at the dusk. I'm sure most of you have heard this in some context or another. And what that means is that the significance of interpretation, particularly of historical texts, what their ultimate meaning or importance is for us, is always retroactive. That particularly for people who are acting historically as historical agents, which of course we all do, and must necessarily so operate based on the particular knowledge and context that we're currently in, because we're caught up with the events, the meaning of those events only becomes more clear later, looking back. And so that also means that the signification of a particular text, particularly and especially an explicitly magical symbolic text, that's intended to not mean what its surface meaning means. It's intended to be esoterically interpreted, but that meaning of that esoteric significance is going to evolve as the new paradigm or new era that's prophesied by the very text itself is itself going to evolve. And so the authors themselves can't in a way know what they're initiating. All they can do is just kind of push the boat out into the river. And in a sense, that's what these authors are doing. They're reading the signs of the times, and they're saying the old feudal order is breaking down and there's a new world coming into being. And we don't know what that means, but we're going to have faith in the divine spirit, however they understand that. And because they are Hermeticists, they do understand that it involves a divinely human element to that. And so it's not just otherworldly for them. This involves a kind of human, historical, natural, scientific element where there's all this new wisdom that they see is going to be discovered. And what's great about that is that they're right. That is what's going to happen. And it's happening and it's ongoing. And that apocalypse that is the modern world is unfolding. That's called the new eon in the Book of the Law. And so the Rosicrucian Manifestoes is kind of like one of the first literary salvos of a type of, you could say, utopian literature that explores this spirit of the gnosis that's coming alive again in a new way as the medieval order breaks up and is destroyed. And we're now going to look next week at the non-Christian but still Western contribution to that. And of course, that's going to involve the Jewish esoteric contribution that's so important to understanding both what modernity means, but also how kind of this Gnostic core of our own tradition, which includes this inheritance, this genealogy, this relationship to not just this Christian Hermeticism, but also this other Jewish Kabbalistic literary tradition. And we're gonna look at how that's operating in parallel with what's going on with what we were looking at this week. So in a way, we've got these kind of two phases where they're kind of overlapping with each other. One's occurring in the Gentile Christian ideological mainstream of European intellectual life. Now we're going to look at the subaltern kind of occult underground, where that's happening in Jewish esotericism, in the Kabbalah, where all this interesting stuff is also going on in this other flip side of the coin. And they're both these important sides of the magical dialogue that's going on. But right now it's 3:30, so I want to thank everybody for coming today. And this completes our first session. Hope you're enjoying it, and we're going to continue to have lots of great classes coming up. So again, next week, Isaac Luria, Jewish Kabbalah and Early Modernity. And thanks everybody for tuning in this week.